Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, it's a huge honour to be invited to deliver, albeit virtually, the annual James Ford Lectures in Irish and British History. I'm deeply grateful to the electors for inviting me to do so, and to Professor Stephen Gunn for guiding me through the planning phases and for his very generous introduction. I'm also grateful to the Warden and Fellows of All Souls College for their kind offer of a visiting fellowship which the ongoing pandemic has prevented me from taking up. I'd also like to thank Trinity College Dublin, especially the Trinity Longroom Hub, our research institute in the arts and humanities, for allowing us to film on campus in the Neil Hoey Lecture Theatre in front of an imaginary audience. The list of previous Ford lecturers reads like a who's who of British and Irish history and includes many whose work I greatly admire. 3 distinguished Irish historians, Marianne Elliott, Roy Foster and FSL Lyons, have given the Fords. Marianne and Roy were based in English universities when they did so the only other person from an institution in the Republic of Ireland to deliver the Ford Lectures was Lee Lyons, back in 1978 when he was the Provost of Trinity College Dublin. So it's a particular privilege to address you. The task is indeed a daunting one, so it's heartening to know that many friends in Oxford, in the UK, in Dublin and in Ireland, around the world, are joining remotely. Thank you for tuning in. Sadly, there are 3 people who can't join us. In the autumn of 2020, we lost Margaret McCurtain, Lindy Guinness, Lady Dufferin and Aidan Clark, all great friends and mentors to me. These lectures are dedicated to their memories. Over the course of the next 6 weeks, I'll deliver a series of lectures on Ireland, Empire and the early modern world. I want to re-examine Empire as process and Ireland's role in it through the lens of early modernity. The 200 years I cover between the mid-16th and the mid-18th century equate roughly to the time span of the first English Empire, and for me it's an English Empire rather than a British Empire. Of course, empire and imperial policies, practices and cultures have shaped the history of the world for the last 2 millennia. It is nation states that are the blip on the historical horizon. In Culture and Imperialism, Edward Said defined imperialism simply as, quote, the process or policy of establishing or maintaining an empire. This aligns with Jürgen Osterhamel's basic understanding of colonial rule as a process of territorial acquisition initiated by military conquest, which is followed by the implementation of formal and informal structures of rule that resulted in a relationship of domination. In this case, between England and Ireland. Even though my focus will be on Ireland, which was England's first colony, it's critical, where possible and appropriate, to look to other European and global empires for meaningful comparisons, contrasts, connections and entanglements. It's impossible in 6 lectures to cover comprehensively Ireland and empire in the early modern world, so I've focused on 4 interconnected themes. First, Ireland as an integral part of the English imperial system. Second, the Irish as agents of empire. Third, Ireland as a laboratory for empire. And finally, the impact that empire had on people living in Ireland. The lectures derive from research that straddles my historical career, now 30 years in the making, from my early work on the MacDonalds of Antrim to my current interests on Ireland and India, and collaborative work with Richard Ross and Phil Stern on Anglicisation in and through the law. These lectures are very much a work in progress, which I hope will appear as a book in due course, but in the meantime, I would greatly value your comments and feedback. Today, I want to begin some of the key themes associated with Ireland and Empire with the aid of a play called Making History by Brian Friel, which was first performed in 1988 but rarely since. I'll assume that you're not familiar with the play, and apologies if you are, so I'll first introduce you to the key characters and storyline. Then I'll explore the historiographies and competing contexts that the play unearths, before suggesting how the play provides a platform for the 5 remaining lectures. Making History is set at the end of the 16th century, on the eve of the 9 Years' War, which began in 1594 and ended in 1603. For the most part, it took place in Dungannon, in modern-day County Tyrone, which is in Ulster, and which was the most geographically remote from London of the 4 Irish provinces. In the play, Brian Friel, who was born in County Tyrone but who spent much of his life in County Donegal, where he now lies, tells the story of Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone and hereditary overlord of Ulster, who led the Irish war effort against Elizabeth I and went on to become the symbolic hero of Irish nationalism. The play opens in 1591 with the elopement and marriage of O'Neill, now aged 41, to his 3rd wife, Mabel Bagnall, who was barely 20, and here is what remains of Bagnall's castle in Newry, along with a contemporary drawing of it. This focus on intermarriage between native and newcomer, Catholic and Protestant, immediately complicates understandings of what it meant and what it means to be Irish and English. Friel conjures up O'Neill's intense relationship with Mabel and her sister Mary, daughters of the local Protestant New English planter Sir Nicholas Bagnall and their brother Sir Henry, who was the Queen's Marshal from nearby Newry. Issues of gender and family are to the fore. Some of the strongest dialogue in the play is between the 2 women as they discuss what constitutes improvement and civility. Mary explains how her father had drained bogland, ploughed it, fenced it, planted it with trees, apple, plum, damson and pear, brought over from Kent. She talks of her beehives, the vegetable patches and the herb garden. Mary then chides her sister Mabel. You talk about pastoral farming. What you really mean is no farming. What you really mean is neglect of the land. And as savage people who refuse to cultivate the land God gave us have no right to that land. In another intense exchange, Mabel defends her decision first to marry this man, Hugh O'Neill, and then to convert to Catholicism. She converted, she says, quote here, out of loyalty to Hugh and to his people. As for civility, I believe there is a mode of life here that is at least as honourable and as cultivated as the life I've left behind. And imagine the Cistercian monks in Newry didn't think our father an agent of civilization when he routed them out of their monastery and took it over as our home. Making History vividly imagines the world of Gaelic Ulster, just as the English state sets out to conquer, to colonise, to cultivate and to civilise. Friel invites us to eavesdrop on O'Neill's discussions with his closest ally and son-in-law, Red Hugh O'Donnell, who has recently escaped from Dublin Castle, where he's been incarcerated for nearly 5 years. Friel rightly emphasises the importance of lineage, kinship, fosterage and marriage alliances. The Gaelic economic order based on pastoralism, exchange and redistribution is foregrounded. Mabel is in awe of the size of her husband's herds of cattle, the source of his wealth. O'Neill used cows as currency, and so cattle raiding, especially in the long winter evenings, formed an integral part of the local redistributive economy. Here we have John Derrick's engraving of a cattle raid from the Image of Ireland. A successful cattle raid often resulted in the submission of a territory, which enhanced the military and political standing of a given lord, brought him increased riches in the form of tribute. O'Neill and O'Donnell were amongst a small number of powerful overlords who not only controlled their own territories, but also collected tribute in the form of military service, food, lodgings and agricultural labour, and they were able to demand submission from neighbouring lordships. Scottish mercenaries These Galaglas, or Redshanks as they became known, supplemented the Irish swordsmen who fought for O'Neill and O'Donnell. Between the 1560s and the 1590s, some 25,000 mercenaries found employment in militarised Ulster. External observers struggled to comprehend what they perceived to be the apparent lawlessness. They were, in the words of another character in the play, Peter Lombard, Archbishop of Armagh, quote, constantly at war, occasionally with the English, but always amongst themselves. If fighting served as one central pillar on which Gaelic society rested, feasting was the other, something captured here in Derrick's image of the feast, with the chief of the McSweeneys seated at dinner, entertained by a bard and a harper. Feasting was a public display of a lord's power over his followers and mattered hugely to O'Neill, as did those traditions associated with musicians, harpists, bards and storytellers that enhanced his standing and his status within his lordship. These customs and traditions were clearly very strange, even alien to Mabel, who is unable to speak Irish, but they are non-negotiable for O'Neill. Just as Gaelic culture is core to his identity, the fact that he has fathered many sons and continues to keep mistresses plays to his masculinity and status as a Gaelic chieftain. Despite Mabel's complaints, O'Neill refuses to dismiss his harlots, as Mabel dubs his lovers. She then justifies their presence to her sister on the grounds that this was part of his culture. Equally insightful are O'Neill's deliberations about Englishness, both with Mabel and his trusted friend, foster brother and private secretary, Harry Hovenden, who, unlike O'Neill and O'Donnell, is of New English descent, but Catholic. Even though Friel suggests that O'Neill was educated in England, he was in fact raised amongst the English of the Pale, first in the Dublin household of Sir Henry Sidney and later with the Hovenden family, hence the close bond with Harry. John Derrick dedicated his image of Ireland to Sidney, who features in this engraving as he leaves Dublin Castle. On the foot of this upbringing in Sidney's household, O'Neill has acquired the necessary trappings of civility. He speaks, according to Friel, with a, quote, upper-class English accent, and like those old English knobs in Dublin. O'Donnell teases him about his excessive jacket, later adding, I bet you that's a London job. O'Neill enjoys friendships with many of the families who settled in the Pale. O'Neill, by his own admission, made himself indispensable to English soldiers and settlers as they attempted to colonise East Ulster. He did what he could to bring in O'Donnell, Maguire and the other lords. Here's a wonderful map of mid-16th century East Ulster, which really formed part of the extensive cartographic collection owned by Sir William Cecil. As we'll see later, in other lectures, maps were very important tools of empire. For her part, Elizabeth needed to secure the support of these regional power brokers, and especially magnates like O'Neill, if she was to exercise any influence in Ulster, the remotest part of her empire, something that the map really evokes. To Elizabeth, this was terra incognita. This imperative meant that even after his defeat in the 9 Years' War, O'Neill was still able to negotiate terms, something that O'Neill, well versed in the realpolitik of Tudor government, truly understood. However, surrender in 1603 also meant that O'Neill had no alternative but to engage with the Crown's local agents, men like Henry Bagnall. After all, as O'Neill reminded Mabel, it's the plodding Henrys of this world who are the real empire makers. From the 1570s, English soldiers and bureaucrats like Bagnall held a royal mandate to exercise brute force in Ulster, building forts and garrisoning men in strategic locations and launching fire and sword campaigns, often under the guise of military rule. Towards the beginning of the play, O'Donnell outlines the aggressive English military strategy in Ulster and I'm quoting here, "Do you know what the Hurs are at? They're going to build a line of forts right across the country from Dundalk over to Sligo." And this is, of course, exactly what happened. Here we have Bartlett's map of Ulster from 1601. The remains of these early 17th century castles and fortified houses litter our landscape, as these from County Fermanagh illustrate. O'Neill understandably detested Bagnall, whose ambitions to be Lord President of Ulster threatened his preeminent position in the province. He called Bagnall a Staffordshire mongrel and a bloody upstart. Bagnall's racism also ran deep, and he lamented, both in the play and in the historical record, of his humiliation and shame that, quote, his blood should now be mingled with so traitorous a stock. Denigration of the other came with an imperative to replace everything Irish with everything English. The landscape was to be shired, primogeniture was to determine inheritance practices, and English law was to replace Brehon law and customary law. Even though violence is endemic and omnipresent throughout the play, the significance of the English victory, first at the Battle of Kinsale in 1601 and then 2 years later in the 9 Years' War, is muted. It was Mabel who reminded Hugh that, quote, "This is a war that England must win because her very survival is at stake." There are fleeting but nonetheless intense images of the destruction on Donegal wrought by English troops. Even if his focus is the local, Friel never loses sight of the wider contexts of England, Scotland and especially Spain and the papacy, from where O'Neill and O'Donnell have secured support for their Catholic crusade. Lombard, played by Niall Tobin, embodies the connections with Catholic Europe. Lombard was a distinguished theologian and, as O'Neill's first biographer, began the cult of O'Neill as national saviour. In the play, most of O'Neill's exchanges with Lombard, first in Dungannon and later in Rome, focus on the meaning of history and allow Friel to challenge the nationalist myth of O'Neill as the symbolic hero of Irish nationalism. Time and again, O'Neill insists that Lombard must tell the truth, especially about his relationships with Mabel and Harry. Lombard fobs him off with, "I'm not even sure I know what the historian's function is, not to talk of his method. Maybe when the time comes, my first responsibility will be to tell the best possible narrative. Isn't that what history is, a kind of storytelling?" "Is it?" asks O'Neill. Lombard replies, "Imposing a pattern of events that were mostly casual and haphazard and shaping them into a narrative, that is logical and interesting. Oh yes, I think so." "But where does the truth come into all of this?" asks O'Neill. Lombard replies, "I'm not sure that truth is a primary ingredient." Is that a shocking thing to say? Maybe when the time comes, imagination will be as important as information. But one thing I promise you, nothing will be put down on paper for years and years. History has to be made before it's remade. Nearly 25 years do pass. History is made and remade. In the final scene of the play, O'Neill, having left Ireland in 1607 as part of what is now known as the Flight of the Earls, is in Rome with Lombard. Broken and blind, O'Neill again insists that the Archbishop tell his story exactly as it happened. Again, Lombard pushes back. "What are you so miserable about? Think of this book as an act of pietas. Ireland is reduced as it has never been reduced before. We are talking about a colonised people on the brink of extinction. This isn't the time for a critical reassessment of your ploys and your disgraces and your betrayal. That's the stuff of another history for another time. Now is the time for a hero. Now is the time for a heroic literature." Making history exploded the myth of Hugh O'Neill as a national hero. Instead of a hero, Friel portrays O'Neill as a complex man, redolent with ambiguity, who flitted between two very different worlds. He was a great Gaelic lord, the O'Neill. He was also an English earl, comfortable with the language and the trappings of England, a friend to English men, a lover of English women, and a servant of the English Queen. Friel also imbued O'Neill with qualities: ambition, ruthlessness, hybridity, pragmatism, passion, charm and charisma that made him accessible and human. Finally, Friel rendered O'Neill as a leader who was capable and willing to negotiate, to accommodate, to compromise, to survive and to reconcile, something I'll return to. For now, it would be remiss of the historian in me not to note the sources that fired Friel's pen. He did draw on historical records, but it was the romanticised and very popular biography, The Great O'Neill by Sean O'Faolain, that really inspired his narrative. As a result, the play at times has a confused internal timeline. Events are conflated and composite characters created. In other words, Friel strays from the known facts. As we've seen, O'Neill was not reared in England, but amongst the English of the Pale. While O'Neill met Lombard in Rome, the Archbishop, originally from Waterford, never visited Ulster, spending most of his life on the continent. Mabel's biographers, who include the late Aidan Clark, simply tell us that she died in 1594 without issue. There is no evidence to prove that she died in childbirth, as the play suggests, though it was certainly possible. I could go on, but this misses the point of the play, which is about language, identity, and the relationship between history and myth. This brings me to the second part of this lecture, where I want to explore contexts. The first, that in which the play is set, the turn of the 17th century. The second, that in which it's performed, the late 1980s. And finally, the context in which we're discussing it today, the early 2020s. I'll examine the context of the 17th century at length over the course of the next 5 weeks. So here, let me look briefly at the historiographical debate that is of particular relevance, even if it's a rather tired one, on whether Ireland was a kingdom or a colony or a hybrid combination of both. The passage of the Kingship Act in 1541 transformed Ireland's status from a patchwork of feudal lordships into an imperial kingdom. This constitutional revolution redefined relations between the English king and his subjects, especially those of Irish provenance, who were now accorded the same rights as those of English origin. Ireland now formed part of a composite monarchy or a multiple kingdom. After 1603 and the accession of this man, James VI I, to the throne of the three kingdoms, Irish Catholics of Old English and Gaelic provenance proclaimed their loyalty to the House of Stuart and celebrated in poetry, plays and polemics their status as a kingdom. The Ulster poet Mackinvard, who later shared continental exile with O'Neill, welcomed James VI I as Ireland's spouse and depicted Ireland as a distinct kingdom in the context of James's three crowns. From the mid-17th century, the Protestant ruling elite joined the chorus, asserting that Ireland was a distinct and self-governing kingdom, united to England only by the link to the crown. The Protestant elite, like the Old English elite, objected to Poyning's Law, dating from 1494, which mandated that the English Privy Council approve in advance all legislation introduced in the Irish Parliament and thereby placed control in the hands of the King and over time his Westminster Parliament. Matters came to a head in the 1690s. William Molyneux wrote his influential Case of Ireland Being Bound, arguing that only the Irish Parliament could legislate for the Kingdom of Ireland and dismissed the claim that Ireland was a colony of England. The English Parliament and prominent figures condemned and contested Molyneux's assertion. For example, Sir Isaac Newton, the renowned scientist and warden of the Royal Mint, argued, and I quote here, "Ireland is one of the English plantations, and though it has changed the title of lordship to that of kingdom, yet it still continues annexed to the crown of England like the other plantations. He added that Ireland, quote, ought to be inferior to this kingdom and subservient to its interests. The Declaratory Act of 1720 confirmed Ireland's subordination as England's first colony. Ireland's colonial status has invited comparison with other English colonies, especially in the Atlantic world, both by contemporaries, Newton wasn't alone, but also by later historians, most importantly D.B. Quinn and Nicholas Canny. A generation of scholars, geographers, literary specialists and historians have offered nuanced case studies illustrating the interconnectedness of the Atlantic world and the challenges and opportunities that a comparative approach affords. Others have taken issue with this colonial model and suggested that the nature of rule in Ireland was very different to the Caribbean and the mainland American colonies, and that comparisons with other European composite monarchies or with frontiers and borderlands could be more useful. Of course, these three models, colonial, composite monarchies and frontier, are not mutually exclusive, and over the course of these lectures I will draw on all three, especially the colonial. The backdrop for this kingdom-colony debate, along with a wider one around Irish revisionism, was the Northern Ireland Troubles, a bitter and bloody sectarian conflict which began in 1968 in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement and ended 30 years later with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. Though none of the scholars who engaged in the debate sought to promote division or animosity, the use of the word colony became politicised, as did discussions around Ireland's involvement in the British Empire and the extent to which the Republic of Ireland was post-colonial and Northern Ireland colonial. The advent of peace after 1998 has allayed many of these anxieties. That said, we as historians of Ireland have had, perhaps because of the Troubles, difficulty in engaging with empire, leaving it to others to address, and I have in mind here the work particularly of Stephen Howe. Things did begin to change with the publication in 1998 of the Oxford History of the British Empire, the first volume of which was edited by Nicholas Canny. Sensitivities were, however, very real, and undoubtedly some remain. In 2013, Audrey Horning, an archaeologist, published a book called Ireland in the Virginian Sea, Colonialism in the British Atlantic, and rejected altogether any notion of a shared colonial framework. In the preface to her book, she acknowledges how the Troubles influenced her research, and here I quote, "Memories of the plantation are routinely invoked by partisans of both traditions, and how the Unionist community finds the word colony challenging." Without wishing to stir up the hornet's nest associated with Irish revisionism and revisit the toxic exchanges of the late 1980s and early 1990s, one must ask of Horning's study, as Gerald Farrell does, whether, and I'm quoting, "the subordination of the evidence to produce history which promotes intersectarian reconciliation must inevitably suffer from the same shortcomings as history designed to promote divisions and animosity." While subordination of the evidence is highly problematic from the perspective of the empirical historian, the poet and the playwright are less constrained. And this brings me to the second context I want to explore, that in which making history was written and performed. By deconstructing and humanising a nationalist hero, Friel intended to make O'Neill more acceptable to Unionist communities. He offered a message of reconciliation and invited his audiences to use their history to imagine another future. And of course, Friel did so at the height of the Troubles. On the 20th of September 1988, at a moment of grisly political deadlock in Northern Ireland, the Field Day Theatre Company premiered Making History here in the Guildhall in Derry, or Londonderry as the plantation town developed by the City of London is also known. Then, starting in Dungannon, O'Neill's heartland and close to his inauguration site here at Tullyhogue, Making History toured the country with 59 performances in 21 towns over 10 weeks. Making History then opened in London at the National Theatre, where I saw it with Stephen Rea playing O'Neill. Rea and Friel had founded Field Day in 1980 as an intellectual response to the Troubles, and they were quickly joined by Seamus Heaney, Seamus Dean, Tom Paulin, Davy Hammond and Tom Kilroy. It is important to remember just how bleak the 1980s were. Bloody sectarian civil war gripped the north. South of the border, recession mired the economy, outward migration reached high levels, and Catholic doctrine continued to prevail. From the outset, Field Day determined not to privilege one tradition over the other, but to use arts and culture to engage and energise local communities, to nurture the notion of a fifth province, that of the mind, and to invite people to reimagine inclusive possibilities. The plays opened up new ways of thinking about identity and often had clear political messages, as in the case of Making History, which had dislodged O'Neill from the pantheon of great nationalist heroes. Of course, Field Day was not without its critics. Writing in the 1990s of the 1980s, Colm Tóibín suggested, quote, Field Day has become the literary wing of the IRA. Field Day's insistence that Irish problems were inextricable from British imperialism complicated further matters for some at home. But this also linked Ireland to global debates around post-colonialism. Over the course of the 1970s and 80s, Edward Said had redefined and reframed the relationship between literature and empire and put the emphasis on the colonised rather than the coloniser. Post-colonial theories developed by Said, Homi Bhabha and others took Irish studies by storm. By the 1990s, it was impossible to conceive, some have argued, of Irish literature outside of the history of colonialism, decolonisation and nation-making. Ultimately, however, post-colonialism had the unintended consequence of perpetuating Eurocentrism, and the more current world systems approach to literature has moved attention away from nation-states as discrete entities towards more comparative and global perspectives. And here I'm quoting from Ronald MacDonald's excellent chapter from the final volume of Irish Literature in Transition. Just as Irish literature has taken a global turn, so has Irish history. Interest, albeit slowly, shifting from the political master narrative to multiple narratives that embrace the social, economic, environmental and cultural histories of the peoples living on the island, along with those who have left, and of Ireland's relationship with the wider world, including, of course, Britain, our nearest neighbour. Of particular importance was the call for a Kirkham Atlantic approach to history that allows us to escape territorial and national boundaries and to adopt transnational and global frameworks. The wider emphasis on transnationalism and global history is empowering Irish scholars to engage with issues of identity, migration and empire in a more inclusive, interdisciplinary and comparative way, and with a recognition that it is impossible to separate imperial history from national history. Entangled and connected historical frameworks rather than comparative ones have also allowed for the analysis of the transfer and operation of imperialism, albeit in very different contexts. These approaches acknowledge differences of geography, scale, culture and history, which often resulted in local accommodations. In other words, these fresh frameworks invite us to change the questions we ask. This brings me to our third context: how we should read Making History today. The Ireland of the 2020s is a very different country to that of the 1980s, something that the recent referenda on same-sex marriage and abortion highlight. Most importantly, Ireland is at peace, even if Brexit and the rise of English nationalism threatens the stability of the peace process. Though the context may have changed, issues of language, identity and the relationship between history and myth are as important as ever. And we, as a nation, continue to engage with this. In 2011, we welcomed to Ireland Queen Elizabeth II in a truly historic visit. It was a moment to bow to the past without being bound by it. Over the last decade, we have marked a number of very significant centenaries, including the First World War, the most imperial of conflicts, the 1916 rebellion, which helped to trigger the unravelling of the British Empire, and the partition of Ireland, which served as the template for the later partitions of India and Pakistan, Israel and Palestine. This period of commemoration, combined with recent campaigns associated with Black Lives Matter and Rhodes Must Fall, are forcing a fundamental re-examination of our history, how we remember and how we forget. Over the past 100 years, most of the imperial statues in the Republic of Ireland have been removed or destroyed. But the legacy of the British Empire lives on in our street names, our built heritage, the plantation towns, the big houses, government buildings, our universities and their curriculums, in the collections in our libraries and museums, in our language, our fashions, our folklore and our foodstuffs. Until recently, few fully appreciated the significance of Ireland's imperial past, but this is changing and there's a growing awareness of the importance of informed discussion and respectful debate. The fact that the great Irish philosopher George Berkeley owned in the 1720s slaves on his partition in Rhode Island made national headlines, as did the revelation that John Mitchell, a revered 19th century Irish patriot, supported slavery. Edmund Burke, his statue here outside Trinity, was a vocal critic of the East India Company and compared Ireland and India on the basis that they were similarly victimised. On the one hand, Burke thought that empire was morally indefensible, while on the other, he had sugar and slave interests in the Caribbean. Berkeley, Burke and Mitchell are all graduates of my own university, Trinity College Dublin. I'll have more to say in later lectures about Trinity's role as an instrument of empire. Now I simply want to acknowledge how we as a university are reflecting on our imperial legacy. Colleagues in the history department and around Trinity have launched an initiative called, provisionally, Slavery, Imperialism and Racism, that aims to engage the college community in a critical discussion around Trinity's colonial legacies. Over the course of the next 18 months, a postdoctoral fellow will be invited to undertake a full audit of endowments, prizes, buildings, named chairs and collections. No doubt the researcher will find many skeletons in the college's closet, as well as recovering stories of staff and student activism. I'm not entirely sure where this journey will take us, but what is clear is that we're at the beginning of something very important. I hope that we can learn from others and from how others, Glasgow, Bristol and of course Oxford, have engaged with their imperial pasts. In addition, historians across these islands are facilitating conversations about how we decolonise Irish history. Some of you may have participated in the recent event hosted by Torch in Oxford, or in another hosted by the Trinity Long Room Hub. If not, check out their websites. I'm still very conscious, though, of just how charged the current political context is in which I'm delivering these lectures. A recent op-ed I published in the Irish Times created something of a storm on Twitter, with a small and anonymous group of racist extremists launching venomous attacks on me and another colleague in Cork. This unpleasant experience of being trolled demonstrated to me that our history, so core to our identity, really does matter. Like it or not, empire and colonialism has profoundly shaped us. And I sincerely hope that these lectures provide a platform that allow us to begin to explore in an honest, respectful and informed fashion some of these issues around race, inclusion and empire. What it means to be Irish at the turn of the 21st century. As well as being acutely aware of the challenges of the present, I'm also very conscious of the limitations of the past and of the dangers of over-relying both on English language archives and on the experiences of the English Empire. As we all know, and as this slide from a mural at JNU in Delhi makes very clear, history is all too often written by the winners. In case you can't see it, the caption reads, "Until deer have their own historian, histories of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." As I wrote these lectures, I made every effort to interrogate available evidence in whatever language and form: written records, state papers, legal and taxation records, surveys, correspondence, diaries, pamphlets and treatises. They all offer insights, as does material culture and visual sources, portraits, engravings, maps and architecture. Works of poetry, prose and performance help to recapture emotions and more nuanced senses of identity in early modern Ireland. I may be an empirical historian, but I have a deep appreciation of the insights offered by the related disciplines of literature, but also of archaeology, geography, gender and legal studies, and digital humanities, and I draw on them all throughout these lectures. In terms of my own research on Ireland and India, I'm very dependent on the archives of the East India Company, which are enormous. However, there is also important material in the archives of the other European powers who operated in early modern India, especially in Lisbon, but also in Amsterdam. But what about the non-European archives? When I was living in India in 2015, I employed a graduate student fluent in the local languages to check out the archives in Mumbai and Surat. Nothing of relevance appears to have survived for my study, which makes more important still the European sources, even if these records are of control and extraction. The biased nature of the archives makes it even more important to engage with the archaeology of physical remains and material culture. Here we have the tomb in the English cemetery at Surat of Gerald Ainger, the founding father of Bombay, whose grandparents settled in Ireland at the turn of the 17th century, and I've lots more to say about him in later lectures. Here too are the remains of the original 1670s fortifications that Ainger built in Bombay, very close to the sea link at Worli. Material culture is important, especially textiles. This exquisite bedspread from the remarkable collection in the Victoria and Albert Museum celebrates the Stuarts and the introduction of the pineapple into England. As part of the Mughal Empire, India clothed the world in the early modern period and formed part of an integrated global trading system. The calico trays that gripped Ireland and England in the 1660s and 70s coincided with Ainger's time in Bombay and Surat, and its success is attributed by many scholars to him. This mention of the Mughal Empire brings me to the importance of situating experiences of colonial Ireland in wider geographical and geopolitical contexts, and challenging any notions we may harbour about Irish exceptionalism. The fact that Ireland responded to similar sets of transformative processes, globalisation, state formation, confessionalisation, the professionalisation of warfare, commercialisation and so on, does facilitate interrogation that is comparative, connected and entangled. Recent research that I'm doing at the moment with Richard Ross and Phil Stern suggests that the Spanish Habsburgs ruled their dominions in South America and interacted with their political elite, much as the Stuarts did in Ireland. Identifying differences is as important as examining the similarities. For example, prior to the 1690s, the fact that many people in Ireland practiced a religion different from that of their king would not have been tolerated elsewhere in contemporary Europe, save for the Dutch Republic. In later 17th century Ireland, the Crown effectively accepted religious pluralism, arrangements more akin to those made in the Ottoman, the Safavid and the Mughal empires. From the mid-16th century and the reign of Akbar until the mid-17th century and the reign of Aurangzeb, de facto religious toleration characterised Mughal rule in India as the Muslim emperor did all that he could to accommodate the majority Hindu faith. So whether in Ireland or in India, there's much to learn from looking at the operation of early modern empires, even if the scales of such empires might be very different. Occasionally, there are direct, intriguing connections, something that this wonderful Mughal miniature illustrates. It shows Emperor Jahangir accepting a book from a Sufi and preferring the Sufi to a king. In this case, of course, the king was James VI and First. By way of conclusion, let me provide a brief overview of the remaining lectures. The next two lectures develop some of the issues Friel raised in Making History and examine Ireland as an integral part of the English imperial system. My second lecture begins with Hugh O'Neill and the conquest, colonisation, civilisation, cultivation and commercialisation of the island itself. Next week, I explore these 5 C's under the umbrella of Anglicisation. As we'll see next week, there's no escaping discussion of race, religion and rebellion, or of extreme violence, exploitation and expropriation. But there are stories of negotiation, assimilation, acceptance, survival and tolerance that need to be told, something that I'll do in the third lecture, where I want to look at the traditional configurations of kingdom, colony and empire through the prism of gender and marriage, and to suggest that imperialism might also be conceived of as a matrix of interconnections between colonised and coloniser. Lecture 4 looks at the Irish as empire makers, the plodding Henrys, both Catholic and Protestant, who played active roles in European global expansionism. By 1660, Irishmen were to be found in the French and Spanish Caribbean, the Portuguese and later Dutch Amazon, Spanish Mexico, and the English colonies in the Atlantic and Asia, where they joined colonial settlements, forged commercial networks and served as clergy. How did these encounters and experiences shape their identity, and how did others perceive them and represent them? Equally, how might this hibernocentric perspective challenge, complicate, and even change received understandings of empire, especially the English one? Lecture 5 explores the extent to which Ireland served as a laboratory both for imperial rule and for resistance to that rule. Processes and practices of government, especially legal and landed ones, and others relating to Anglicisation characterise the implementation of English imperial authority in both Ireland and across the empire from the mid-16th century. In addition to analysing influences and actions distinctive to English rule in Ireland, it's important to acknowledge those shared more widely by early modern empires. Equally challenging is how we draw insights across time and make meaningful connections from the early modern into the modern period, rather than reading history back from the present and thereby losing sight of context. It's also important to ask, as Nicholas Canny has done, how Ireland inhibited English global expansionism by draining away financial and human resources. Finally, Lecture 6 focuses on the impact of empire on Ireland. Given the interconnectedness of the early modern world, how did empires shape the lives of those who remained in Ireland? How did imperial commodities, especially food, drink, clothing and furnishings, and representations of empire in novels, plays, prose, images, travel literature and maps, form and influence ideas, identities, mindsets, tastes, fashions and landscapes? Finally, how is Ireland's engagement with and experience of the English Empire remembered or not, represented or misrepresented? White supremacists in the United States misleadingly suggest that Irish indentured servitude in the 17th century Caribbean equated to white chattel slavery and thereby distort the true meaning and misery of black slavery. While some in Ireland continue to celebrate connections with the British Empire, which they date back to the plantations of the 17th century, many have either conveniently forgotten our imperial past or are simply ignorant of it. Empire may still be a dirty word in some quarters, but Brexit and the campaigns around Black Lives Matter and Roads Must Fall have kindled a greater awareness of the importance of revisiting the history of empire, if only to better understand its legacy, how it has shaped the present, and how this might allow us to forge a shared future. I do hope that you can join me next week for the second lecture. For now, thank you for your attention today.